What is the best way to check your bike? Maybe you've got a big race of important ride coming up and you want to be absolutely sure your bike isn't going to disintegrate halfway through. When I was working on World Cup downhill races or the Enduro World Series races, this would be the last thing I would do before handing the bike over to the rider. The first thing I do before I actually put the bike in the stand is I'm just going to feel around the bike to see if I can detect any play or anything wobbling loose. You might have heard of a thing called the M check, which is where you trace an M shape on the bike and you kind of go over the bike in that order to make sure everything is as it should be. Well, it's kind of a quick one of those really. You're checking for play across the axles, you're checking for play in the headset, the linkage around the shock. It's just a really, really good way to know what you're getting yourself in for, and so nothing can be missed. Not only am I dropping the bike and lifting it, trying to detect any play that way, I'm also going to turn the handlebars at 90 degrees, or if on a downhill bike until they're fully locked, and just rock the bike back and forward whilst holding the top of the headset. This is a really good way to make sure that you're not just feeling play in the bushes of the fork, but you're actually feeling it at the headset, if there's any at all. Then we're going to spin the wheels. We're going to try and hear for any kind of rubbing on the brakes, and we're going to make sure there's plenty of material left. Really, really important though, that if you do alter the alignment of the caliper, bear in mind that's going to have to be re-bedded in again to ensure that there's as much pad contact as possible. Because if this bike is going up for a race run, the next time the brakes are going to be used in anger is in race conditions, so everything has to be absolutely perfect. And as you're spinning those wheels, you want to just be feeling the tension of the spokes, make sure nothing's loose. It's also worth just sighting down the rim to make sure it's still nice and true. Another thing when you're sighting down the rim is you want to look at the tyre. Now sometimes racers are hitting turns so unbelievably hard, they can actually warp the carcass of their tyres, every now and then. So you need to look out for that, because it's something that you might never notice if you don't look for it, but it can be a cause of instability at high speed. As you're spinning the wheels, then we move on to the gears. Maybe you do a quick tune up here. Hopefully it shouldn't need any real adjustment, but you're going to check every single link of the chain to make sure there are no plates that are cracked, nothing's splaying. Sometimes, you can be missing parts of the roller assembly. This sounds like it would take you ages, but it just doesn't. And it can, especially when you're putting maybe your highest power through the cranks of the whole weekend on that race run, well, you need to make sure that it's all good. The next thing I do is I'm going to get out all of my Allen keys and any Torx keys that I know exist on the bike, and I'm going to lay them out on my workbench. And starting with the smallest, I'm then going to go methodically from the front to the back of the bike and check every single bolt in that size. Once every single bolt in that size has been checked, the tool can go back in my toolbox or on the shadow board. Then I know there's no room for error and everything is good to go. Now I want to be really clear here. I'm not suggesting that you tighten each bolt, adding more torque each time you check it. You'll want to make sure it's not loose. The issue is that if every time, say this bolt here, every time I checked it, I tightened it by an extra 1/8 of a turn, which doesn't sound like much, over time you're eventually just going to snap the head off the bolt and it's going to damage your componentry. So what you really, really want to be sure to doing is checking that it's tight. You can use a torque wrench perhaps, but not overdoing it. What I've seen some mechanics do, which I think is a really nice trick, is when they know everything is torqued correctly, they get a paint pen and they draw a line across the bolt. Then they can visually inspect if that line is out of alignment. Well, then it's clearly not where they left it. I think that's a pretty cool trick. Next, I'm going to give the spring a bit of a rattle if it's a coil sprung bike, and I'm also going to check, just look through the air can this way. You're looking for a little gap between the air can and the main body. This sounds like a really stupid thing, but it happened to me a couple of years ago where I gave the suspension unit to the service centre, which you get at races because you're too busy working on other parts of the bike, and I got it back. The rider rode it, no problems. And then just before they went up for their race run, I looked across and just by pure chance, it caught my eye and I could see fresh air behind it. And, who knows what would have happened. until I managed to tighten it up. Things like that are really, really important to check, especially if you're getting, a third party to service your suspension. It's also worth checking, especially on the Float X2 air shocks, the orientation of the valve, because sometimes it can foul on the frame. But if you deal with the suspension unit out of the bike, there'd be no way to know that. So just check for any clearance issues as well. Next up, it's air pressures. Now this is a bit of a contentious one. I used to get pretty obsessed with it, I'm unashamed to say. What you want to be doing when you're checking your air pressures is being consistent. What you don't want to do is get to the top of the lift. If you're riding in the Alps, racing in Europe, there can sometimes be quite a significant altitude difference between where the pits are and the top of the race run. And so you see some people all week, they're checking their tyre pressures in the pits, and then for their race run, they check it at the top of the run. But they're going to be different. What you need to do is choose your conditions, so in terms of elevation and temperature, and stick to them. So don't leave your bike in the sun before checking your tyre pressures, because you're going to get something that isn't consistent with what you've been practicing with. Largely, it doesn't really matter what it says at the top. What matters is it's the same at the same height. I hope that makes sense. I personally don't like to check the pressure of suspension units. I know some people that do. I got recommended by a suspension engineer not to, just because he said that you're increasing the risk of an air leak by constantly connecting the pump, and you might detach it and more air comes out. But I would give it a thoroughly good bounce and make sure it feels about right. When you do get to the top of your run, just give the tyres a quick squeeze. That's all you want to do. Don't go reaching for that electronic pressure gauge, because like I said, it could be your undoing. The last thing I would do is I get the bike on the ground and I give it a good old rev test on those grips. Really put a lot of force, grip as hard as you can. Something like a loose grip, well, it can be tight. It can be sometimes up to torque. But under real high load in exceptional circumstances, like you would in a race run, it can twist, and nobody wants a bit of whiskey throttle as that hammering through a rock garden or something. It's the most horrible and alien sensation, and just completely, well, you lose all confidence because you don't know how you can push the bike. Another thing I do is I go for a quick ride, just to make sure it's all good. Like I said, I bounce the bike around, do some skids, make sure the bike's working, get on the brakes, get on the power, feel the gear changes. That's really, really important to me. In terms of washing the bike, this one's a difficult one. When you're at World Cups, the last practice run finishes, and depending which group you're in, you might not have that much time before you head up for your race run. And I wouldn't want to give the rider something that was inconsistent. So I wouldn't want them to go up on wet brakes if they've been practicing with dry brakes for the whole week, which obviously they would have. So I probably wouldn't wash a bike just before a race run, but I'd give it a good dusting down. And be sure to listen out for any noises as you are even just pottering around the car park. Get some movement from side to side, maybe do a few cutties. Little bits of play can be detected like that and can literally be the difference between finishing a race run and not. And there we have it. There is my pre-flight check to make sure your bike, like I said, isn't going to fall apart and lead to a few tears and a wasted race entry. Now, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you want to stick with the channel, you can click up here to see my real-time service on a shock just like this one, and you can click down here to see Doddy convert to a tubeless system on an entry-level bike. As always, guys, don't forget to like and subscribe, and thank you very much for watching. We'll see you next time.